Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you are watching us on our YouTube channel, you know you can check us out wherever you get your fine podcast content, or even not so fine podcast content. We are on the many platforms that are out there. If you're listening to us on one of those platforms, go and check out what's happening in studio by checking out our YouTube channel. We've got a brand new Twitter feed at Lunch Hour Pod on the Twitter machines. And as always, hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and let your friends and family members' friends all know about how much you're enjoying the lunch hour. Very excited to bring on our guest. I don't spend enough time talking to the good folks at the Reason Foundation and the Reason family of websites about the work that they're doing. His name is Adrian Moore. He's the Vice President of Policy at Reason. Moore leads Reason's policy implementation efforts and conducts his own research on topics such as privatization, government and regulatory reform, air quality, transportation and urban growth, prisons, and utilities. Gonna have to ask him about that because we've just finished watching season 3 of The Mayor of Kingstown, Adrian. Moore has testified before Congress on several occasions, regularly advises federal, state, and local officials on ways to streamline government and reduce costs. He was in the Army before joining Reason, which is a very unique aspect, I'm sure, amongst his Reason colleagues. He was on the active duty and reserves for more than a decade. Earned his PhD in economics from UC Irvine, master's in economics from UC Irvine, and a master's in history from CSU Chico. What used to be called Chico State, is that right?
It's still called Chico State.
There you go. Chico. I love that. I one of my wife's med school colleagues went to Chico State and spent a lot of time. I think you know this. I spent a lot of time in California growing up, so more on the Central Coast and the Central Valley to an extent. Adrian, I mean, let's go here because you and I had this conversation a couple of weeks ago about the REINS Act, and I don't know if I've had any of your colleagues from Reason on. I mean, obviously, we talk about regulatory reform. There's a lot that's going on here. Actually, I don't know if you've seen it, but Wayne Cruz just had his piece up at Forbes about the first 6 months of the Trump administration. And setting aside other things that you and your colleagues at Reason may not like about what's going on, talk about what's been happening on deregulation with the Trump administration. What's working? What isn't working? What do we need to be watching more carefully?
So far, I would say that the first Trump administration was more systematic and successful on deregulation than so far. But I will also say there have been a lot of other priorities in this first 6 months. So
right.
The attention of leadership has essentially been more on other issues than it has been on sort of the draining the swamp / deregulation. Though I will say a lot of the personnel changes and things, the reductions in force and things that went on do obviously affect the spread of regulation and bureaucracy. So I mean, it's all part and parcel. I mean, right. These things are kind of overlapped. It's but I feel like there was also this go around partly with the Doge approach to things. I mean, it was dramatic to see and generally I think did a lot of good things, but it was also not as transparent as it could have been and caused a lot of chaos. And, they've already had to roll some of it back. So it wasn't as systematic and analytical. And I was so disappointed that Congress they created committees to back the play, in a sense, to pass the laws, to back up the efforts that Doge was doing. And then they just sat on their hands and didn't do it. And so
it's interesting because, you and I think you and I both agree that this idea, we used to, the detractors of regulatory reform used to decry the issue of paralysis by analysis,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And I think for yours and my liking, and again, not to put words in your mouth, I like the idea of slowing down the process through analysis because, again, I agree with you. It's all about deliberation. I'm guided by Justice O'Connor's sentiments in New York versus United States. The Constitution protects us from our own best intentions, right? We got this process
Yeah.
down the road. But the flip side to this is that when you want to do the right things, or you want to do good things, sometimes maybe, I mean, as it's been explained to me, the reason why they weren't more systemic with Doge, as offended as we might get over this, is because they knew that if they went down a deliberative road, they might get bogged down. I mean, talk about that, the twin
Yeah,
problems
there's
there. I mean, because this is something that's not just with the federal government, but also state and local governments. Talk about that.
yeah. No, I mean this is something that is hard to do at the federal level. That's why in the first administration it was a more decentralized process
Right.
where it was the Trump and he what he did was he appointed a lot of people to all the agencies and said, you know, I've got this. We had the 2-for-1, right? You got to remove
Right.
two for every new one. But that was sort of just a green light to go in and figure out what regulations maybe shouldn't be in place or what personnel were maybe just a bureaucratic lard. And those agency senior appointees, you know, did a lot of the heavy lifting, which was, you know, they had a lot of data at their own level. It was more analytical. It's hard to do it in a centralized fashion. Not that
Right.
you can't. I mean, I would point to some, you know, maybe the most notable one would be when Jeb Bush was governor of Florida. He
Right.
set up a process to do this statewide in Florida that was very successful. There's been a few other in
Yeah, Glenn
Virginia,
Youngkin right now in
Texas.
Virginia is doing
Yeah,
it. Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
Right.
You know, so those are models that you know I was hoping Doge would turn into. It was definitely more technology driven, you know, taking advantage of the access to the technology and the databases with Doge, and I think that brought an interesting direction to it. But there was, you know, somewhere between just take first glance at things and make changes and let's study it for 6 months is the
Right.
right answer, right? And
Sure.
I think, you know, the pendulum
Yes.
swung too far.
I mean, yeah, I get that. It's funny because this is a conversation I've had with my research assistant quite a bit about this because one of her frustrations has been that there's been so much focus in recent months on very old and outmoded regulations and getting rid of those. And we know we're going to talk a little bit about AI in a moment, but one of the things to come out of this GW symposium that I went to last week was conversations with folks who they are using AI as a tool to go out and root out dead weight in terms of the regulatory side of things. And I don't have a real problem with, I have zero problem with that at all. I mean, one of the things I've
Yeah.
cautioned my research assistant on is this idea that, you know, you go back and you deal with the dead weight. Of course, we want to go back and look at the excesses of the last 4 years, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I mean, talk about the idea of getting rid of some of the really old dead weight and how technology might help us in that regard.
Yeah. So I have some thoughts on that. And then I kind of have a question for you back at you.
Sure thing.
You know, so one of the things that Reason Foundation on the policy division side, that many of you may not know, Reason kind of has two divisions. One's a journalism division. A lot of people are very familiar with reason.com and the journalism work. And then reason.org is where our policy work is. And where I work is on the policy side. And a lot of what we do is work with state and local lawmakers and sometimes in Congress on the legislation of change. So as these AI tools have developed, one thing that I have learned is a lot of times if I want to say, what is the law on X in Kentucky?
Sure.
You know, it's laborious to go in and research that. I've had to do that for almost 30 years.
Right.
And I am astonished at how excellent these AI tools are at helping. It's like having a research assistant.
Absolutely.
I can get to the analysis. So if you think about that, if these tools are so able to analyze the entire tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of a single state's code to find everything that has to do with, let's say,
Housing regulation, local land use regulation.
Yeah, or sewer outlets or whatever you might want to look for, then its ability to capture that makes it much easier for you to figure out, wait a minute, why do we have rules that do, when you look at the totality like that, you can see where the old outdated rules are, the weird things that got added on that have been overcome by technology, or the things that just plain don't make sense anymore. And kind of the thing that has really struck me in this process. So you and I'm guessing it was at least 20 years ago, the first time you and I did something on regulations together, on working on business regulation reform and stuff. And in fact, I think it was a project that had to do with capturing what all the state laws were on various things. And we've really gone through a change in how both culturally and I think strategically we think about regulation in this country, where it used to be that the fight over regulation, sorry, I've got a thunderstorm happening here. The fight over regulation was, there's something that people perceive to be going wrong in the market. And we think that if the government got involved, they could do a better job than the market is at solving this problem. And we might argue about that, but I think the main argument is the government approach actually going to be superior? And, you had pro-regulation folks saying, oh, yes, of course, well-intentioned bureaucrats will always do better than evil capitalists. And, we were saying, well, wait, if you actually look at the data, the markets often do a lot better. And I feel like the pro-regulation side was kind of losing that battle on the data over the last couple of decades. So things shifted. Now, when you look at most regulatory proposals in Congress and at the state and local level, they are, here's a new thing. The market hasn't even had a chance to fail. It certainly hasn't had a chance to fix whatever problems emerge. But because I can imagine as a legislator things that could go wrong, or as a lobbyist, or as an advocacy group, this is what we see with AI. AI hasn't been around long enough for market failures to emerge or for the market to solve those problems. And yet everybody wants to regulate them.
But we've all seen the Terminator, Adrian. We've all
Well, the culture is like that too. Culture is like, the government should prevent problems from ever happening, as if they have this all-seeing, all-knowing power to do so. So I feel like mostly what we're fighting is regulations that are designed to preemptively or prophylactically prevent imagined future harms without any clue of whether those harms are going to come to pass, or even worse, any clue whether the markets solve them, which means it's now no longer a data-driven debate. We can't answer them with data because they never let the market work unencumbered. And so they're winning by default in a lot of ways because they've redefined the fight to this philosophical one.
Isn't it interesting? Because I think you've hit on something. Because at the same time, we are in a renaissance, I think, in which folks are understanding the cost of regulation, right? It was 2016, the first time I ever heard the phrase regulatory budgeting uttered on a primary debate stage. I was like, oh my God, we're at a moment here. But at the same time, I think you're right. There is this embracing of the European style precautionary principle in terms of undergirding a lot of the answers here. And the traditional left-right divide has shifted in that regard, where, you have some folks.
So much. I mean, look, the amount of regulatory laws proposed and passed in Florida and Texas this year is just appalling. They looked like freaking New York 10 years ago. I mean, where did this come from? How did Republicans come to embrace so much regulation? Now, they still haven't caught up with California, but it's pretty crazy.
But again, it gets down to this idea of what is the role of the state in determining these things. I mean, I would say, that there's a better understanding now of the concept of regulatory capture and cronyism. and how sort of, guilds, right? Because I wrote a piece in graduate school about the guild model of regulation, this idea of, you have sort of these private entities and they do, seals of approval on things, but the problem, of course, is then they can shut out anybody who wants to enter the marketplace, which gets into the issue of like certificates of need, which I know is quasi-governmental. Yeah,
Right.
actually, but let's shift gears actually and talk a little bit about the state and local work that you're doing, because it is so vibrant. The work you're doing on transportation issues, one, but also on housing. Let's start there with talking about regulation and housing supply and prices and what people don't seem to understand about the way markets work when it comes to housing and rentals. Talk about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is such a great example of. I do agree. I feel like there's a push me, pull you going on culturally
Right.
and intellectually on regulation that makes it a very interesting time. So there's lots of good things happening and lots of bad things happening. But in housing, it's been good. So the fundamental thing, if you don't follow housing issues and you haven't really thought about the of housing affordability crisis and sort of regulatory issues therein, is the process the local governments mostly control the supply of housing.
Right.
The private sector builds it, but nothing gets built without approval from a local government, city or county. And culturally, left and right, we've adopted a largely restrictive approach to allowing new housing, to where there are very few communities in this country where the supply of housing is allowed to keep up with the demand. So,
Right.
You've got places like where I live, where we're growing by about 15,000 people a year, and they're permitting 2,000 or 3,000 houses per year. Well, you can see pretty quick,
Sure.
if you're that with all that demand exceeds supply, that drives up prices, as it does in everything. People forget housing operates just like the market for apples, pretty much, except it takes longer to, well, I don't know, it takes a while to grow a tree. So,
Yeah.
but it takes a while to build these things, and so there's a lot of lags in it. But local governments have become very restrictive because the natural
Hold on for 1
instinct
second.
of,
Hold on.
oh, yeah, sure.
Stick a pin in this for 1 second, because I want to actually. How many of our public policy problems are really resource economics problems? Whether or not it's the housing supply issue, or, to some extent, the supply of food, or, as I've spent a lot of time talking about, health care as opposed to health insurance. Why do we have this fundamental lack of understanding of the fact that so much of this is about supply meeting demand? I mean,
Right.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. You don't have to.
No,
respond. You can keep going
absolutely.
with that, but
I
it's-
live, you raised it is a lot of things. I mean, I live in Florida, right? Where one thing that most people outside of Florida don't know is we have this massive and worsening imbalance between people who need healthcare and medical professionals.
Right.
So medical professionals in Florida are retiring or moving out. And so you can't find a GP, a general practitioner, a family doctor here hardly.
Yeah.
They've all closed their doors to only serve their existing patients. You
Right.
move in, you can't find a doctor. It's incredible. It's supply and demand. So
Yep.
yeah, I think it does. A lot of these issues are a failure to recognize that at the root is a supply and demand problem, because we focus on the whole regulatory web that's built up around it and what the laws are, and we forget that under that's a market that either
Yes.
is or isn't working.
And I'm sorry, I rudely interrupted you, Adrian. You were talking.
Yeah,
about
no.
this.
So that's a good broader point. So in housing, we have this disconnect. Now, interestingly, the last 5 or 6 years have seen a huge wave of deregulatory efforts across dozens of states that started on the left of all things to happen. There was, you probably heard of NIMBY, right? Which is not in my backyard, which is the word we use for people who recognize that something needs to happen, but they don't want it near them.
Right.
And this is what happens with housing: is everybody knows that a growing community needs more housing. Just don't build it anywhere near me.
Absolutely.
Well, if every single existing resident has that idea, you can't build anything anywhere, right? So that NIMBY keeps pushing on, who shows up when a developer goes in front of the city council to get permission to build a new development. All the NIMBYs show up.
Yes.
the people who are going in the future to live in that housing development, they don't show up because they're hypothetical at this point, right? So that process just keeps restricting housing supply. Well, in California, they started a YIMBY movement, a yes in my backyard, because the housing problem was so bad in California, even the most progressive residents of that state were like, holy cow, we've got to get markets working here again. And that has spread. So you've had deregulation of housing markets happen dramatically in California and then spread to all these states. Texas this session just passed a handful of bills that are going to make a huge difference. It made it harder to protest against new housing, made it easier to build like duplexes and things instead of only allowing single family homes. Right. You can still build single family homes, but you also can build duplexes and things like that. And this has happened in Montana, Georgia, states all over the Midwest. Kind of the hottest states in the last couple of years have been Florida, Texas, and Montana. So we have a big deregulatory wave going in housing. And I think we should be looking at that and saying, how do we replicate that on, small business regulation and, land use, environmental land use regulations and things like that.
It's funny. I had no idea, read about it until I saw one of those weird listicle articles on the web, that the land just to the west of LAX, right on the ocean, was at one point residential, and then it was all condemned, and now it's just wasteland. And it's like, I know there are a lot of people who would love to live, right on the beach, then wouldn't care less about being right next to the airport.
Right. The problem. So that's an interesting one that I've had to deal with here in my own town in Sarasota, Florida, where land near that was close enough to under the path of the planes that were taking off. So technically legally allowed to develop. But the airport director came and said, here's the thing, under our legal system, the fact that people move into a place that is under an airport flight path does not equate to agreeing that they're willing to live with that noise. So you can move in to the end of a runway and then sue the airport for the noise.
See, okay.
And that is our system. That's the way the court decided
this is like the person in Austin, Texas, who
can't contract. Yeah, you can't. What we ought to be able to do is put a rider, like an HOA on that land, and say, you got to sign a contract that says you can live with it. And the courts have ruled you can't sign away your right to future sue over nuisance.
Wait a minute. You can put easements, permanent conservation easements on property like that, but you can't put some kind of a reverse easement. No. I mean, as I said, there was this crazy case down in Austin, Texas. Now, I don't know about you, Adrian. I love barbecue. I do competition barbecue with my brothers. I love the smell of wood smoke. I would love to live next to a world famous barbecue establishment. In fact, that would be the selling point, is I'm living next to.
I would weigh 300 pounds.
But, yes. Well, listen, you eat just the protein and you're fine. But the point is, some neighbor of Terry Black's barbecue. Well, I've toured the pits at Terry Black's barbecue, because that's what I do. And it's amazing. Sued over, they didn't like the wood smoke smell. It's like, what did you think you were getting into here? And by the way, it's Texas, and barbecue is a sacred right, RITE, of Texas. No, it's amazing. Look, let's talk about transportation, because that's also one of your great areas of expertise. I think folks are finally understanding that light rail and high-speed rail just aren't working. And yet we still, again, you talk about NIMBY and all of those things. Maybe that was part of the problem in Southern California. But, whether it's high-speed rail between Houston and Dallas, or light rail in Tucson or Minneapolis. Why do we keep going back to these 19th century solutions to 21st century congestion problems?
It's just got to be psychological, because I can't find any other explanation.
Okay.
People who are like, hey, here's a technology that it's been outdated forever, but because we can come up with sexy new applications of it, we can look at China, where they have every 100 miles they have cities with 10 million people, and it turns out trains are really successful there.
Right.
And you think, well, we want that.
Listen,
Well, we have
when you're
every
sharply
100 mile.
restricted in how you can buy a car, and otherwise
Yeah,
your only personal mode of
exactly.
transportation is a
Not
bicycle.
only that, but every 100 miles in the U.S., you have a city of 50,000 people, not
right.
15 million.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's just crazy. And because we have a huge airline market and a fairly deregulated airline market, flying is fairly efficient and cheap. So the light rail thing, it is, I mean, the part of it I can understand is it works really well when there's a lot of density.
Yeah.
And so if you're imagining a world with a lot more density, then that makes sense. And in fact, part of the solution to our housing problems is allowing parts of cities to be denser if that's what people want.
Right.
And what you currently have is local governments restricting density even when the market wants it, which is crazy. But our ability, technology to overcome that is, this is a story throughout all regulatory issues, is to what extent is this being driven by a change in technology? Right. And the change in technology and transportation is that buses have gotten so superior to rail. You can have buses that are just as nice to board and ride in as a train car is, as a light rail car is. But you know what? They're independent of each other. Right. They're on wheels that can turn. They're not stuck on a track. So they can have more flexible routes, and they're just vastly cheaper. So the places that have invested in what's called bus rapid transit, which is buses that operate more like a train, are the places where you've had success at increasing transit ridership. And that's really the goal here is, we don't want to force people to use transit. What we want to do is make transit so attractive that people choose to use it instead of driving. And until we recognize that, we're not going to get anywhere. But the transit establishment in this country is so invested in rail and in trying to induce people to use it and try to restrict car use instead of making transit attractive and a winner in the competition.
And let's be fair here. Like when we're talking about rail, I mean, obviously this is largely different than freight rail, which is a whole nother issue. I mean, in terms of being able to move goods and goods across I was going to say goods and services. Obviously, we're not moving services by rail. That's a whole different thing. But right, that's the issue here. You wrote about this. Actually, let's get into sort of the digital stuff. We touched on. Let
me do a sidebar real quick that bridges. It seems like everything's AI these days. Well, we just had an article go up day before yesterday, Friday. Sorry, about automated rail inspection. So this is self-driving vehicles with AI analysis that you can send this truck down the rails without a crew on it, and it can do the rail inspections much faster, much cheaper, and much more effectively than the existing system. How many less derailments are we going to have as this technology rolls out and improves our ability to manage those freight rails? Technology is becoming a key part of everything.
Well, and that gets into it. I mean, coming back to this issue of compliance, right? We touched on it. This is, I did the math, right? And one of the other things I think we talked about years ago was the work you were doing in conjunction with the good folks at the NFIB Research Foundation. They haven't updated their paperwork cost per hour of paperwork study in a bit, but just going on and accounting for inflation right now, paperwork would cost about $70 an hour, federal paperwork. And if we saved every small business in America 1 hour of paperwork per week, that would save the economy. And actually, this is the question. That would save the economy about $110 billion a year, right? Just that little bit. And that's just in direct regulatory costs. I brought this up with a buddy of mine, colleague in the regulatory world. And he said, well, Andrew, what we don't want, and I want to get your take on this, what we don't want is to obfuscate the compliance burden so that folks aren't going to push back against greater levels of regulation. And I want to get your thoughts on this. I think it makes its own gravy, but
yes,
but your thoughts on this, because I think if the
technology
goal is
makes it easier to comply with regulations, and therefore the cost of regulation is less, and so let's go ahead and regulate, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's definitely a force that's at work, and the judo that you've got to pull on that is, wait a minute, if this technology allows compliance, then there isn't a market failure anymore that needs to be solved by this regulation.
Right.
What you need is a system that maximizes the efficient use of these technologies for purposes of ensuring safety or whatever it is. Yeah,
listen, it was a great point to bring up with me, because obviously this has been, again, something that I've been thinking about. We have been, when they delivered regulations.gov in 2003, right, which was, I will say, revolutionized the interaction that we all have with these agencies in terms of how we file comments. And I think we've gotten better comments into the docket as a result, for the most part. We were promised this idea of having some kind of compliance assistance program, but we never had the technology to deliver it. And now if we don't have it now, we are very close to having that technology to deliver it. This idea that if you are, folks have heard me use this example before, if you are a small ceramics maker, right, and you need to keep track of your glazes because of their toxic materials, right? If you're filling out paperwork that's going to go to the EPA, there's no reason why it can't also go to OSHA at the same time. Why should you be filling out multiple forms? This is important stuff here. But at the same time, right, there is this question that's out there. And so at least I think we need to ask ourselves the question, well, what is our goal in terms of policy reform? Is it reducing size and scope of regulations? Yes, I think that's absolutely true, but it's also reducing the burden of compliance. And I think we can, again.
So they go together. And I think I would take it back even one more step and say that we should always be questioning whether we know that this regulatory setup is the best way to solve this problem.
Right.
Because even if it is at a moment in time, as technology changes, that changes. And unfortunately, our regulatory process is very locked in and doesn't do well at letting go of things when technology solves the problem that originally regulation was put in place to solve. And we don't think that way, like with AI right now. You've got, my favorite example is early in the rollout of some of these algorithmic technologies. So some companies developed a technology to help judges do bail.
Yeah.
So basically, it looked at all the data on people that had committed. So you could say, here I've got a Hispanic 19-year-old who lives here, who has this education level, who has this kind of work, that married, not married, all this demographic data about the person, and they committed this crime. And you could compare it to other very similar people in the whole database and say, this person is this likely not to show up for trial.
Right.
Which is the main purpose of bail. Right. Which is to ensure that people show up for trial. And so it would give a empirical analysis of that probability to help the judge. Now, the judge is going to use his gut a lot too, because he's talking to the person, right? But still, now he's got some hard facts to go with it. Well, a bunch of people on the left blew up about this because it turned out that there was some racial bias in this analysis, because the data that it learned on was created by judges making actual decisions, and there's some racial bias in the population of judges. And so they said, we have to ban this technology because it has this racial bias. And I kept raising the question of, how easy it is to change the algorithm to solve that problem? Do you know how hard it is to change all the judges to make them less racist?
Oh.
And yet we banned that technology. And so now we have the known racial problem of the judges. We gave up the chance to solve it through technology, which is just crazy. And yet we're doing that over and over.
It gets into, David Stockman wrote his book, The Triumph of Politics, which is one that I have. Normally I have it right here, and I think it's in my other studio. But he always talks about sort of the way we tinker around with policy, and invariably we always go through what is the bloodiest process out there, like the most insane Rube Goldberg-like way of looking at things. Listen, Adrian, before I let you go, because you've been very generous with your time, I should have teed this up as we were talking before. But I always ask my guests about their outside interests, right? Because I think it's important for folks to understand that people have outside interests from what they're doing. So I almost did a podcast that was solely based on talking to folks in politics and policy about their outside interests.
Yeah.
So when you're not doing your policy work, I know you're now living in Florida. What are you doing when you're not doing your work?
Yeah. So, my two main, let's say three. I have three main things I do in my off time. I'll start with the more virtuous ones first. So I do, we live in kayaking country.
Nice.
My wife and I do a lot of kayaking. And second, I play disc golf.
Wow.
Passionately, multiple times a week. So
nice.
I played regular conventional ball golf most of my life, but my brother introduced me to disc golf when I turned 60, and I converted and never looked back. It's fantastic.
Different discs for different shots, right?
Exactly.
I'm understanding this. I haven't done this in years.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
Just like choosing a club.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And then the third thing is I am still a gamer.
Okay.
I play on my Xbox frequently.
There you go.
I've got childhood friends that are now live all over the country, and we still play Xbox together frequently.
It's amazing how we can all stay in touch that way. It's so funny on the kayaking thing. We invested a couple of years ago in I got a pedal kayak that I love.
Nice.
It's been a bit anyway. I've had an injury last year that sort of prevented me from using it. So we're getting back into it. Adrian, how do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing at the Reason Foundation?
Yes. So you can find all of our policy work at reason.org, all of our journalism at reason.com. And if you want to follow me on X, I'm at Reason Policy.
At Reason Policy on X, Adrian Moore, he's the Vice President of Policy for the Reason Foundation. Thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Our guest, as I said, has been Adrian Moore from the Reason Foundation. This has been the latest episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. Please, if you are listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms that are out there, you can check us out on our YouTube channel. If you are watching us on YouTube, you can always take us with you wherever you want to go by finding us on the many podcast platforms at which we publish and syndicate the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. I am your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.